Three lighthouse keepers set out for a few weeks on a remote, uninhabited island. Their usual routine takes a dramatic turn when they discover a chest of gold in the wreckage of a crashed boat. Isolation and the temptation of wealth turn their stay into a psychological ordeal. This psychological thriller is based on the true story of the disappearance of three lighthouse keepers on Scotland's Flannan Isles in 1900. It begins at a bustling pier and a local port where preparations for the watch are underway. Among the crew are Thomas, a seasoned senior keeper with 25 years of service, his trusted colleague, James, and a young newcomer, Donald. The trio boards a boat and sets off for the distant island where the lighthouse is located. On the way, Donald suffers from seasickness, unaccustomed to the rough seas. Finally, the austere silhouette of the island appears on the horizon. After landing, the outgoing crew departs, leaving Thomas with a report on the state of the equipment, including a broken radio that effectively cuts them off from the outside world. Upon reaching the lighthouse, the men are greeted by a loyal dog named Jed, who had been left on the island. They immediately get to work. James and Donald clean the lighthouse lenses and refuel the generator, while Thomas conducts an inventory of supplies, carefully tracking alcohol levels to prevent overconsumption during isolation. Due to a broken winch, they manually hoist supplies from the pier using ropes. During this, Donald tries to joke around by jumping on James, but James easily shrugs him off. By midday, the men are catching crabs along the coastal rocks to conserve supplies. Over lunch, Thomas notices Donald struggling to prepare the crabs and shows him an old pirate trick involving a rope and lever to crack the shells, a method Thomas claims pirates once used for torture. In the evenings, the keepers pass the time singing folk songs accompanied by James on the violin. After one such evening, Thomas visits a small chapel near the lighthouse, lighting candles in memory of his deceased wife and daughter. One night, a powerful storm breaks out. Waves crash violently against the rocks, and the cries of seagulls pierce the air. Electricity flickers, prompting the men to climb the spiral staircase to inspect the lighthouse. They discover mercury leaking from the lamp. Wearing protective suits, James and Donald collect the liquid metal and refill the lamp. Once the lamp is operational again, Thomas lights it, while James pulls the inexperienced Donald back to avoid being blinded by the intense glare. Morning brings an unpleasant task. Due to the storm, numerous birds had crashed into the lighthouse, leaving the area littered with dead bodies. Later, while exploring the island with Jed, Donald discovers a wrecked boat lodged in a crevice. Nearby lies the body of a man clutching a mysterious chest. Upon learning of the discovery, Thomas instructs Donald, being the lightest and most agile, to descend using a rope. Carefully climbing down, Donald checks the man and confirms he is dead. Following Thomas's instructions, he secures the chest to be hoisted up. However, as the older men pull the chest, the dead man suddenly awakens and attacks Donald, trying to drag him into the water and drown him. In the struggle, Donald manages to grab a rock and strike the man in self-defense. Back at the lighthouse, a shaken Donald sits in silence as Thomas comforts him, explaining that he did the right thing to protect himself. James suggests opening the chest to see its contents, but Thomas adamantly refuses, stating that if someone was willing to kill for it, they shouldn't give in to temptation and should leave it alone. The night passes in tension. Unable to calm himself, Donald wakes Thomas to talk. Over tea, he shares how he once tried to ask out a girl he liked, only to be rejected because he was illegitimate. When asked about his family, Thomas gives a brief and somber response, indicating that he once had a family, but they are no longer with him. Later, James explains to Donald that Thomas's family had passed away, leaving him to live a solitary life. Unable to sleep, Thomas sneaks into the room with the chest. Using lockpicks, he opens the lock and finds tools hidden beneath a false bottom, along with gold bars wrapped in cloth. Realizing that knowing the contents would only bring trouble, he puts everything back in place and locks the chest. In the morning, Thomas tries to fix the broken radio to report the recent events to the mainland but discovers that the device can only receive signals, not transmit them. Meanwhile, James prepares breakfast, gathering spices for soup. While occasionally glancing at the cloth-wrapped body of the stranger they retrieved from the crevice. During breakfast, Donald once again suggests opening the chest to understand what nearly cost him his life. Thomas refuses, stating that such knowledge won't bring peace. When Donald blames Thomas for what happened, Thomas silently walks away. Later, he notices through the window that Donald is speaking with James near the storage room, stirring Thomas's suspicions. Soon Thomas finds his colleagues in the room standing by the open chest, disobeying his orders. They discovered gold and cannot hide their excitement over their newfound wealth. However, the senior keeper, with his life experience, does not share their joy. He reminds them that sudden wealth will require explanations, leading to a lifetime of lies. If they conceal the stranger's death and the truth comes out, they will face severe consequences. Moreover, it remains unknown whether the deceased had accomplices. The discussion nearly escalates into a fight between Thomas and Donald, prompting the old man to step outside to cool off. Upon returning, he proposes a plan. They will keep the gold but proceed cautiously. First, they must dispose of the body and all evidence. Then they will hide the gold along with the stranger's belongings, and continue working at the lighthouse for another year. During this time, Thomas will find a trustworthy buyer to sell the gold. Only then will they devise a believable explanation for the sudden influx of money. As the three lighthouse keepers carry the body to the cliff to throw it into the sea, Thomas spots a boat approaching the island. Sensing trouble, he orders them to hide the body in the chapel and remain out of sight while he meets the visitors. The visitors turn out to be two suspicious-looking men who introduce themselves as Locke and Boar. They ask if a boat belonging to their companion passed nearby. Thomas calmly states that the boat was wrecked and, unfortunately, the person aboard perished. When asked about the cargo, he responds that there was a chest, but it was taken away by sailors from a ship that came after receiving the report of the incident. Locke inquires how many people are on the island and expresses a desire to speak with the others. Thomas refuses, explaining that the rest are occupied with important work. However, a nervous Donald, unable to bear the tension and fearing Thomas might reveal everything, intervenes and approaches the guests. James follows to prevent any mishaps. Locke takes advantage of the situation, subtly questioning Donald and James about the incident. Unprepared, they contradict each other, forcing Thomas to correct their answers, raising Locke's suspicions. Still without sufficient evidence, Locke refrains from making accusations. Before leaving, the visitors ask for the radio frequency used to communicate. Realizing this isn't over, Thomas immediately returns to the house with James to attempt fixing the radio, which still cannot transmit. Donald is tasked with keeping an eye on the departing boat. When Locke and Boar try to contact the lighthouse via radio and receive no response, they quickly deduce that Thomas lies. There is no connection to the mainland, meaning the body and the chest are still on the island. The boat turns around and heads back. Thomas arms the staff and orders them to secure the staircase leading from the pier, to make it easier to defend if necessary. Watching the approaching boat, they notice the intruder slowly sailing along the shore. Searching for a suitable landing spot, the keepers remain vigilant, preparing for an attack. In a fit of rage, Boar hurls accusations at them, calling them liars and thieves, and fires a flare gun, but the shots miss. This continues until nightfall. In the quiet of the night, the barking of Jed catches their attention. Thomas realizes one of the attackers has already landed on the island. He leaves James to watch the boat and rushes to the house with Donald, where they encounter Locke. Locke attacks and knocks Donald out. Meanwhile, Boar sneaks up on James, strikes him from behind with a plank, and pushes his body off the slope. In the house, Locke begins torturing the tied-up Thomas, demanding to know where the gold is hidden. Despite injuries and a knife stabbed into his leg, Thomas remains silent, stalling for time. This proves enough for James, regaining consciousness after his fall, to storm into the house wielding a club. He lands a powerful blow on Boar, knocking him down, and begins strangling him. At the same moment, Donald regains consciousness, recalls Thomas's lessons, grabs a rope, loops it around Locke's neck, and tightens it using leverage until the attacker collapses. To recover from the bloody fight, the keepers move the bodies aside and sit down at the table for a drink. During their conversation, Donald notices a silhouette in the window. They rush outside and see a stranger running into the night. Armed with a crab-catching hook, James catches up and delivers a heavy blow. However, upon approaching, he is horrified to realize the victim is a boy resembling his own son, possibly the child of one of the bandits. The next morning, James, in a state of stupor, prepares breakfast. Constantly glancing at the three bodies now lying in the yard, he takes it upon himself to throw the bodies into the sea, including the boy, which further shatters his psyche. Upon returning to the island, his behavior becomes erratic, causing concern for Donald. The young man proposes to Thomas that they take the gold and escape, leaving James behind. But the elder keeper firmly refuses. Overcome with guilt and despair, James stands at the edge of the cliff, swinging his hook, and confesses to Thomas that he no longer feels anything and cannot even remember his wife's face. Thomas tries to comfort him, saying time heals all wounds, but his words bring no relief. Leaving James to reflect alone, Thomas takes Donald away, later finding James talking to himself atop the hill. Thomas realizes his friend is on the verge of a breakdown. When James fails to complete a task, Donald offers to help, triggering an argument. In a fit of rage, Donald shouts that James's son will grow up knowing his father is a murderer. Thomas overhears their fight and intervenes just in time, throwing Donald out and trying to calm James. To ease the tension, James retreats to the chapel while Thomas gives Donald a stern lesson in discipline, explaining that such words only make things worse. Despite Thomas's attempts to reconcile his colleagues, the tension remains. James cannot forgive Donald and blames him for all the troubles on the island. At dawn, the senior keeper, limping from his injuries, takes breakfast to the chapel, leaving Donald to pack up their belongings. The young man again tries to convince Thomas to leave the island with the gold, before James loses his sanity completely. Their conversation is interrupted by the sudden sound of a siren. In a rush, they run to the storage room and find the valve blocked with a mop, but James is nowhere to be found. The men search the entire island, but there is no trace of him. As night falls, Donald, while packing the gold into a suitcase, once again persuades Thomas to leave the island. At that moment, the door unexpectedly opens, and James enters. Calmly he asks if his comrades are planning to abandon him. James assures them he has thought everything through, calmed down, and is now fine. The three sit at the table, and Thomas suggests having some whiskey to ease the tension and reconcile. However, when Thomas goes to the pantry to get the ball, James locks him inside and slowly turns to a terrified Donald. Locked away, Thomas hears sounds of a struggle. After forcing the door open, he finds James on the floor, holding Donald's lifeless, strangled body. In shock, Thomas drinks water to steady himself, but as James approaches, he knocks Thomas unconscious with a blow from a ladle. Leaving the two bodies in the room, Thomas wanders outside and heads to the chapel. There he spends the night confessing to his deceased wife. The next morning, Thomas returns to the house to find James sitting at the table. James suggests they leave the island together with the gold, as Donald had previously proposed. Having made his decision, the two set off in a boat into the open sea. On board, Thomas removes his hat, kisses Donald's body, and lowers it into the water. Watching this, James asks Thomas for one last favor, but the elder refuses, urging him to think about his son and family. James, unwilling to let his child be raised by a murderer, jumps into the water. Surfacing again, he pleads with Thomas for help. Unable to bear it, Thomas leans over the side, places his hand on his friend's head, and pushes him beneath the water. Thomas holds him down until the last bubbles disappear from the surface. Now alone, Thomas realizes he is utterly isolated. The boat drifts slowly across the endless ocean, merging with the gray sky on the horizon. And so the story ends. Subscribe to the channel to ensure you don't miss our upcoming movie reviews.